Well, hi, folks. Pat Flannery here. I'm the editor of Fenestration Review magazine, and today I'm joined by Paul Majka from Henkel Corporation. We're going to have a great discussion today about 5 critical flashing objectives when sealing your window openings. Paul Majka is applications engineer for Henkel Corporation. He provides technical support for sound building practices using sealants and adhesives for commercial and residential construction. Paul's actively involved in consulting and training architects, engineers, contractors, and product suppliers. Through 44 years in the industry, he's worked as a contractor, energy specialist, and building diagnostician. Really couldn't have anybody better here to really give us some great meat and potatoes information on sealing up your windows. Paul, welcome, and thanks very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks, Pat. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, Paul, let's turn first of all to what we're discussing is basically 5 critical flashing objectives. You've broken it down to a step-by-step thing. Paul, what though really to start off are the most critical considerations for installing a well-sealed window?
Yeah, when it comes to windows or even doors, those penetrations, those very large penetrations that we have in our wall systems, are really critical to make sure that we not only seal them up well so that we're addressing exfiltration, infiltration of air itself and some moisture. We want to somehow manage some of that moisture, but so that's one thing, and that's really addressing kind of the energy side of things, right? That's trying to make sure that we're somehow controlling that or managing that to keep our cost of our heating and cooling our buildings down. But also it has to do with durability. And we talk about sealing up windows and doors, and a lot of times the thought is that we're sealing up for just what I just said, just dealing with air movement and moisture movement. But then we're also thinking about the components within the wall assembly and addressing the fact that we've got to keep water out, or if water is able to somehow get behind part of that assembly or some layers of that assembly, that we're addressing that water and able to create a pathway to draw it out so that our structural wall system and our exterior cladding and even our interior finish is not somehow having any issues with damage to water entry. So it's really 2 things. It comes down to energy efficiency and also durability.
Great. So let's dive into the sort of the main considerations for how we do that. Let's go one by one. What's the first critical flashing objective we're going to talk about?
Yeah, the first one is just it is more of a strategical part of the 5 different objectives. The other 4 have more of a directive to them. But the first one really comes down to addressing the strategy. How am I going to, before I install this window or door component, how am I going to somehow make sure that I protect the rough opening? The rough opening that is there for that component to be installed in is typically going to be the structural portion of the wall assembly, right? So we've got to think about, if water was able to make its way in, how am I best to protect it? In many ways today, with the different types of flashing membranes that we have, the sealants that we use, we have to strategically think about that. There's a number of different ways to flash or seal windows and doors and wall systems, depending on the configuration of your wall system, right? Because we have different configurations. We might have masonry openings, rough openings. We might have wood rough openings. We might have steel rough openings, depending on what sector of the industry we're building in. And so we've got to think about, how are we going to make sure that our steps and procedures we use are going to make sure that that rough opening will constantly stay intact, will not be damaged, and will provide the structural strength that we need going forward. So protect the rough opening being the first objective. It's kind of the, let's stop and think about this before we install, and let's make a plan. So that's our first objective, is to make the plan. The second one, Pat, it gets into what we call drain at the sill. And this one's a little bit different. This one is more, like I said, a directive. It's saying that at the sill, the bottom of that opening, how are we going to make sure that first off it's protected, but then water, if it was able to get to that sill possibly. But sometimes we might have a window after 20 years that the corner on it might, the weld might crack on a vinyl window and maybe some water gets into that sill. Is that water going to be able to collect at that sill and then have the ability to drain out? And that's really critical. So what we have to do is think about possibly putting a slope to the sill when we apply the sill flashing membrane. And then on top of it, is there going to be a back dam, something to stop that water if that water does collect, to stop the water from going toward the interior side of the building? And then is it going to have some type of weeps or openings that will drain out? That could drain out to either the structural wall drainage plane, or we might decide to drain that water out to the cladding surface. So our second objective, and the one that probably in many ways contractors and installers look at as being one of the most important objective, is drain at the sill. And so we have different ways in which we need to do that. And we have different designs that we have to make sure that we've got that water is able to collect and then drain. So that's our second one.
Great. And I think once we've got our sill draining happening properly and we've got our rough opening protected properly, the thing that I'm going to say always gets forgotten is draining at the head. Why don't you tell us a bit about how you take care of that?
Absolutely. And it's really interesting that these two become probably the most important. And the only reason for that is when you think about your window or your door, those are the two areas. Your sill and your head are the two areas that you have a horizontal ledge that might be at the window, right? Because a lot of all of our windows will protrude somewhat out from the structural wall and probably might even protrude out from the cladding as well. And so when water is coming downward, those are going to be the two areas where water could sit, right? Our vertical sides of our windows and doors really don't have an area where water can somehow load. But at the head of the window door, it could. A lot of the water that we see today that goes, rainwater that gets up against our windows and doors, can be naturally driven just through the openings of, say, lap siding that we have on our wall systems. But then some of it's wind driven. So we get a pressure driven rain that gets behind. Now we've got to think about how are we going to address that? Well, there's designs to do that. What we do today is we'll install certain types of what we call a drip cap or rigid head flashings that are installed above the window, and then flashing membranes that are installed over the top of these rigid head flashings, so that we have a way in which it's designed so that when that water comes down behind that cladding and it hits the top of that window, there's not only a protection, a design for protection there, but there's also an exit or a pathway that's made so it'll drain out. So many times you'll see where above our windows and doors, you don't see sealant between the gap between the cladding and the top of the window or door, because they want to leave that open for that pathway for water to drain. So that takes care of that issue as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Letting the water drain and dry is always the best thing to do to the extent that you can. But some sealing is always going to be necessary. Tell us a little bit about how to seal exterior perimeters and what the important concepts are there.
Yeah, and this one, Pat, I think is sometimes just kind of goes by the wayside. It's just thought, well, we just apply sealant there. That's really all we have to do. But there's more to it than that. When it comes to sealing the exterior of a window or door, you've got to first think about what size gaps you have between that window and door. And then a decision has to be made on what type of sealant material you're going to use. So I think when we all walk through hardware stores or lumber yards and we walk through that aisle that's got bins filled with all types of different sealants, it's hard to make a decision sometimes on what type of sealant we need. It's very important when it comes to these types of openings and sealing these up, because they are the largest opening in our buildings. We've got to make sure that it's the right material to be used. So we want to use an exterior sealant, number one. Usually it's going to be somehow labeled. The sealant cartridge should be labeled window or door siding sealant. But we also have to make sure that it's going to adhere well to the materials that it's applied to. So it could be applied to a flashing membrane facer that's been applied to the rough opening, or it could be applied to a different types of sidings or claddings, and then the window or door frame. So that could be vinyl, it could be aluminum, it could be a fiberglass, it could be trim that's around that window or door. So we want to make sure that we're making the right decisions. So the first thing we have to do is know what size the gap is, and that's important, so that the sealant that we're using is an exterior sealant that can handle the gap size. And then secondly, be able to have the type of sealant that will adhere to the materials that are combined to make that joint up. So you have to look a lot of times at the cartridge of the sealant manufacturer, or I would suggest, if they really want to make sure about that sealant and whether it will adhere to some of these different materials, go on the sealant brands manufacturer website and go to what's called a data sheet for that sealant. On that data sheet, they'll have that information right there. And so it helps to give you some comfort level and to make sure that you're using the right sealant, because that exterior seal, again, is going to be the protection for that air and moisture movement, as well as water protection. So it's making the right choices and then just applying it carefully at that point.
Well, it's not that data sheets don't make fascinating reading, but they certainly are necessary when you're trying to get your exterior seal right. Let's talk a little bit now about the interior. You've got the outside all sealed up. What do you need to do on the inside, Paul?
Yeah, the interior side is another one that sometimes goes by the wayside. It's well, we've got the exterior seal, we've got our drainage at the head, we've got our drainage at the sill, we've used all of our different materials that we've made sure to have protection. I guess the interior seal is just kind of a by the wayside kind of thing. It's not really that important, but we'll put some little sealant in there. No, it's really important, even though it may seem like there's redundancy there. It is a big plus to use the right types of materials there. We at LePage really promote that you would use a interior window and door foam in this area, and make sure you understand how to apply it, how much needs to be applied. But what is really great about a foam material, especially in Canada, is we get very cold periods during the season, and we want to make sure that we've got the type of sealant in that gap that's going to provide not only the seal for air movement and also moisture movement, but that we get some thermal performance in there as well. With a regular, say a sealant that we use, a gunnable sealant that we use today, say we can use a painter sealant or something like that, it's going to be okay, but it's not necessarily going to give us the movement capability that we need. We might want to go to some type of seal that gives us a little bit more movement capability, but really getting that thermal performance in there is also very important. So we really like to recommend you take your time and think about that one. Make sure that you're using a product that will be able to handle movement. The other thing we want to think about is it paintable? Because sometimes you might be replacing windows and leaving your interior finish in, so you want a paintable sealant. But if you're going to use, say it's a new construction and you're going to use foam in that gap, then just make sure that you're applying that foam correctly. And like I said, that will do the job of addressing the air movement, the moisture protection, but also give you some thermal performance that is really, really important in that gap. So with that in place, and the other thing I will add is that at the bottom of the window, especially for new construction, because we just talked about the drainage at the sill, there's a cavity underneath that window that we're going to have that water could collect and drain. That interior seal at the bottom is also not going to be just your air movement protection, your moisture movement protection, but it's also going to be what we call a back dam in that lower section of the window there, because it will make sure that water can't enter in, and it will drain out to the exterior. If we don't seal well at the bottom of the window on that interior seal, then we could have some real issues with water as well. So we really want to kind of build that interior seal up more than sometimes it's thought about, to make sure it's the right products that are in there. We provide a little bit of thermal performance, and then we also are addressing any kind of water entry as well. So that kind of finishes it off for the interior side as well.
Great information, Paul. I think that's going to be very helpful for everybody to think about when they're looking at their process for sealing up windows out there. But what if people need help, if people have questions, what kind of help does LePage offer to window installers?
I would say the best thing is to go onto our website. If you go to LePage.com, you will be able to find out, first off, all of the different sealants that we have to offer. When I talk sealants, I'm talking about not only interior sealants that we can use, a painter type of sealants, but then also our exterior sealants that we can use that will address a lot of the exterior conditions. And then, of course, we've got our window and door foam that's available as well. Not only that information to be able to give you a selection of different types of products that you can use, but we also have services available. We have training online that's available through LePage for installing windows and doors. And it goes through the 5 objectives that we just talked about. So there's a lot of things there. And of course, we do have a number that you can call into if you have other needs for technical advice or support. It's also there on the website.
Fantastic. Paul Majka, applications engineer for Henkel. Thank you so much for telling us all about the 5 critical objectives in flashing.
Great. Thanks, Pat.